Queen Sorvain had not spoken a single word since she landed. That alone told everyone in the fortress something was very wrong. The great iron gates of the Dracari Imperial Fortress groaned open as her warship descended from the dark sky above. The engines hummed low and tired, like an old animal dragging itself home after a long and painful hunt. The landing platform shook under the weight of the ship as it touched down, and the soldiers standing guard on both sides snapped to attention instantly. None of them dared to breathe too loud. The ramp came down slowly. Queen Sorvain stepped out first. She was enormous, as all Dracari of royal blood were. Her silver scales caught the dim light of the fortress lamps and reflected it back in cold, quiet flashes. Her wings were folded tight against her back. Her eyes, deep amber like old fire, were fixed straight ahead and focused on nothing. She walked with the same powerful stride she always had, heavy and certain, the kind of walk that made walls feel small. But anyone who looked closely enough could see that something about her tonight was different. Her shoulders were pulled slightly inward. Her jaw was set too hard. There was a tension in her that she was fighting very carefully to control. Behind her, her soldiers followed in silence. Nobody said a word. It was only when she passed under the main archway of the fortress and the light fell fully across her body that the guards stationed inside finally saw it. Her armor. Her sacred ceremonial battle armor, the one every Dracari soldier in the Empire recognized on sight, the one that had been worn by Dracari queens for over 400 years, was destroyed. Not scratched. Not dented. Destroyed. The great chest plate was cracked clean across the middle, a deep fracture that split the ancient metal like dried earth after a long drought. The left shoulder guard had been partially melted, the edges curling back in a way that should not have been possible for metal that old and that strong. 3 of the side panels were missing entirely, torn away in the battle and lost somewhere out there in the dark of space. The engravings that had been carved into the surface by hands long dead, the family crests and the old prayers and the names of every queen who had worn it before, were damaged beyond what any eye could read clearly anymore. The soldiers who saw it looked away quickly. Not out of disrespect. Out of something closer to grief. Queen Sorvain walked straight to her war chamber, sat down at the head of the long stone table, and placed both of her massive hands flat on the surface. She stared at the wall across from her for a long moment. Then she said very quietly to the chamberlain standing near the door to bring her engineers. They arrived within minutes. 4 of the Empire's finest, the ones trusted with the maintenance and preservation of imperial relics. They gathered around the armor which had been carefully removed and laid out on the examination table, and they studied it closely for a long time. They used their instruments. They measured the fractures. They tested the alloy composition. They spoke to each other in low voices. Then the eldest of them turned to face the queen. He told her they were sorry. The damage was too deep. The central fracture alone had compromised the structural memory of the ancient alloy in a way that their current methods could not reverse. The partial melting on the shoulder guard had altered the metal at a level that went beyond surface repair. Without the missing panels there was no way to restore the original form even if they could somehow address the other damage. The armor, he said carefully, choosing each word like he was stepping across thin ice, was beyond saving. Sorvain did not explode. She did not roar or throw things or strike the table. She simply looked at him for a long moment with those amber eyes that had seen 100 battles, and then she told them all to leave. They left quickly and quietly. She sat alone in the war chamber for a very long time after that. When she finally stood and walked out, she gave one order to her chamberlain. The armor was to be taken to the secure storage vault in the lower wing of the fortress. It was to be locked. No one was to enter that chamber. No one was to touch it. No one was even to speak of it. The chamberlain nodded and carried out the order without question. By the time the rest of the fortress had settled into its night cycle, the vault was sealed and the matter was considered closed. The engineers told no one else what they had found. The soldiers who had seen the damage kept their eyes forward and their mouths shut. Queen Sorvain returned to her duties the following morning with the same cold authority she always carried, and no one brought up the armor at all. Life in the fortress moved on. But deep in the lower wing, behind a locked door, the broken armor lay on a stone shelf in the dark. Alone. Owen had been stationed at the Dracari fortress for about 4 months. He was part of a small human labor exchange program, a political arrangement between the human territories and the Dracari Empire that was still new enough that most Dracari soldiers barely acknowledged the humans walking among them. Owen did not mind that. He was not the kind of person who needed acknowledgement. He was 26 years old, average height, with calloused hands and a habit of carrying at least 3 small tools in his jacket pockets at all times. He had grown up in a small industrial settlement where everything was always slightly broken and someone always had to fix it. That someone had almost always been Owen. He liked fixing things. He had liked it since he was old enough to hold a wrench. There was something deeply satisfying to him about taking a broken object and returning it to what it was supposed to be. His supervisor back home used to say that Owen did not just repair machines, he listened to them. Owen never argued with that. His duties at the fortress were straightforward. General mechanical maintenance. Keeping the human quarters functional. Occasionally helping with equipment in the shared workshop areas when the Dracary engineers allowed it. He worked quietly, stayed out of the way, and went largely unnoticed. That night he was doing a routine check of the ventilation units in the lower wing of the fortress. It was late. The corridors were empty. Most of the fortress was in its rest cycle, and the only sounds were the low hum of the building systems and the distant clank of a guard's footsteps somewhere above. He had finished the third unit and was moving down the corridor toward the fourth when he noticed the door. It was sealed with a heavy lock, newer than the door itself, the kind of lock that had been added recently and in a hurry. The door itself was old stone and iron, the same as everything else in this section of the fortress, but something about it caught his attention. A faint smell. Very faint, the kind of thing most people would not notice at all. But Owen had spent years working around damaged metals and he recognized it immediately. Burnt alloy. The specific sharp and slightly bitter smell of metal that had been exposed to extreme heat. He stopped. He stood there in the corridor for a moment just thinking. Then very carefully he tried the lock. It was sealed tight. He stood back and looked at the door again. He pulled a small scanning tool from his jacket and ran it quietly across the lock mechanism, studying the reading it gave back. It was not a complicated lock. Heavy, yes, but not complicated. It took him about 6 minutes. The door opened with a low groan and Owen stepped inside, pulling out the small work light he always carried and clicking it on. The beam swept slowly across the room and then stopped. He stood very still. The armor on the shelf in front of him was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen in his life. Even broken, even cracked and melted and incomplete, it was extraordinary. The craftsmanship in what remained was so precise and so intricate that it almost did not look like something made by hands. It looked like something that had simply grown that way, natural and inevitable. Owen walked closer. He crouched down in front of the shelf and brought his work light up slowly, letting the beam travel across every fracture and every damaged edge with careful attention. He was quiet for a long time. He tilted his head. He leaned in closer. He pulled a small magnification tool from his pocket and studied the composition of the alloy at the fracture points. He stayed in that room for nearly 2 hours. When he finally stood up and clicked his light off and slipped back out into the corridor, closing the door quietly behind him, his mind was already turning over methods and materials and possibilities in that focused and settled way it always did when he had found something worth saving. He did not know whose armor it was yet. He did not know what it meant to the Empire or to the Queen who owned it or to the 400 years of history carved into its surface. He only knew one thing with complete certainty as he walked back through the quiet corridor toward his quarters. It could be fixed. Owen did not sleep much that first night. He lay on his narrow cot in the human quarters staring at the ceiling, running everything he had seen through his mind over and over again. The fracture pattern. The alloy composition. The way the metal had reacted to the heat that had partially melted the shoulder guard. He had seen damaged metals his entire life, but that alloy was unlike anything he had worked with before. It was older than most human civilizations. The Dracary had stopped producing it centuries ago because the original smelting process had been lost to time. What sat on that shelf in the locked vault was genuinely irreplaceable. That was exactly why he could not stop thinking about it. By the time the fortress began its morning cycle, Owen had already made a decision. He was going to fix it. He did not have a plan fully formed yet. He did not have all the materials he needed. He did not have permission, and he was fairly certain that if he asked for it the answer would be a firm and possibly dangerous no. But none of that changed the simple fact sitting quietly at the center of his thoughts like a stone at the bottom of still water. The armor could be fixed. So it should be fixed. He spent the next 2 days observing and preparing. During his regular duties he moved through the workshop areas with his usual calm and unhurried manner, checking equipment, carrying out his assigned tasks, saying little. But while he worked his eyes were busy. He studied the materials available in the storage rooms he had legitimate access to. He checked the composition of various alloy scraps left over from Dracary engineering projects. He made small mental notes about what was there and what could be combined and what could be adapted. On the second evening he sat in his small quarters with a notebook and worked out the paste formula he had been turning over in his mind. It was based on an old Earth technique used centuries ago by human metallurgists working with fractured high-stress alloys in deep space construction. The method had mostly been replaced by newer technology and most people had forgotten it existed. Owen had learned it from an old manual he had read as a teenager in the settlement workshop, the kind of thick dusty manual that nobody picked up anymore because better tools had made it unnecessary. But Owen had always believed that old knowledge did not stop being useful just because new knowledge arrived. He adjusted the formula carefully to account for the specific properties of the Dracary alloy. It took him several attempts on paper before he was satisfied. Then he gathered his materials quietly over the following day, taking small amounts from various storage areas, nothing that would be missed, mixing them together in a small container he kept sealed and tucked inside his tool bag. On the third night he went back to the vault. He opened the lock the same way he had before, slipped inside, pulled the door closed behind him and clicked on his work light. The armor was exactly as he had left it. He set his tool bag down gently on the floor, took out his notebook, reviewed his plan one final time and then got to work. The first thing he did was clean the fracture edges. This was the most delicate part and he took a long time with it, using a soft instrument to remove any debris or oxidation from inside the cracks without disturbing the surrounding metal. He worked millimeter by millimeter, breathing slowly and steadily, his focus narrowed down to the small circle of light around his hands and the ancient metal beneath them. An hour passed, maybe more. He did not check the time. When the fracture edges were clean he began applying the paste. He used a very fine instrument, almost like a brush, drawing the paste carefully into the crack in thin controlled layers. The paste was designed to bond at the molecular level with the alloy composition, filling the fracture not just on the surface but deep inside where the structural damage actually lived. It needed time between layers to settle and begin its bonding process. So Owen would apply a layer, sit back, wait, then apply another. Slow and patient and completely unhurried. He stayed in the vault for nearly 3 hours that first working night. When he finally packed up his tools and slipped back out into the corridor he had covered only a small section of the main fracture. Maybe 8 centimeters of a crack that ran across nearly the entire chest plate. He was not discouraged. He had expected it to take time. He came back the next night. And the night after that. By the end of the first week a routine had formed itself quietly around Owen's evenings. He would finish his assigned duties, eat a quick meal in the human quarters, wait for the fortress to settle into its late cycle, and then make his way down to the lower wing with his tool bag over his shoulder. He always moved at the same unhurried pace he used during the day, not sneaking exactly, just walking the way a person walks when they belong somewhere and have somewhere to be. He had found that the best way to move through a large fortress without drawing attention was to look like you had a reason to be wherever you were. The work progressed slowly and steadily. The main fracture on the chest plate responded well to the paste. Owen could see under his magnification tool that the bonding was taking hold at exactly the depth he had hoped for. The old alloy was absorbing the compound in a way that suggested it was not entirely incompatible with Earth origin materials. That was the part he had been least certain about and it relieved him more than he let himself show even in the privacy of the empty vault. The shoulder guard was a different challenge entirely. The melting had not just damaged the surface. It had altered the internal grain structure of the metal in a way that simple bonding paste could not address on its own. Owen spent 3 nights just studying it before he touched it at all. He tried 2 different approaches on small test areas before he found a method that worked. A combination of careful low-heat microwelding using the smallest tool in his kit followed by a different paste mixture he adjusted specifically for the altered grain structure. It was slow and it was difficult and on the second night he made a small error and had to spend an additional hour correcting it with a steadiness that he had to force into his hands through pure concentration. But it worked. He also began the process of fabricating replacement panels for the 3 that were missing. This was the part that required the most creativity. He did not have access to the original alloy. Nobody did. So he worked with what was available, layering and treating in surface finishing materials until he had produced something that, while not identical to the original at the molecular level, was close enough in composition and appearance that the join would hold and the visual result would be faithful to what had been there before. He studied the surviving engravings on the undamaged panels for hours, learning the style and the depth and the spacing of the original craftsman's work, before he attempted to recreate the missing sections by hand. His hands were sore every morning. He did not mind. It was on the 5th night that Aldrich first saw him. Aldrich was one of the Queen's senior fortress guards, a broad and weathered Dracary soldier with dark green scales and the kind of permanently suspicious expression that came from spending too many years watching for threats that never quite arrived. He did his patrol routes the same way every night, the same corridors in the same order at the same times, with the precise regularity of someone who believed that discipline was its own form of protection. He turned the corner into the lower wing corridor at his usual time and stopped. There was a human walking ahead of him in the corridor, moving toward the sealed vault, carrying a bag over one shoulder. Aldrich watched him. The human did not run, did not look back, did not behave like someone doing something wrong. He just walked, steady and calm, and stopped at the vault door, and after a short moment the door opened and he went inside. Aldrich stood in the corridor for a long moment. Then he moved forward slowly and stood outside the door. From inside he could hear the faint sounds of small tools working. A soft scrape. A brief hum. Then silence. Then the soft scrape again. He stood there for several minutes. He did not open the door. He did not raise an alarm. Something made him wait, some instinct he could not fully name, a soldier's habit of watching before acting, of gathering more information before drawing a conclusion. He would observe. He would find out what the human was doing in there. And then he would decide. He turned and continued his patrol. But the next night he walked that corridor again at the same time. Owen was there again, slipping through the door with his bag, quiet and unhurried as ever. Aldrich watched. Said nothing. His eyes were narrow and his jaw was tight, and the suspicion sitting in his chest was growing heavier with each passing night. He kept watching. And Owen kept working. The Chamberlain's name was Earith. He was an older Dracari, smaller than most, with pale gray scales and careful eyes that had spent decades noticing small details that others missed. It was his job to know the condition of every room, every storage chamber, every locked vault in the fortress. He did his morning rounds the same way every day, moving through each section of the building with a small record tablet in one hand and a quiet efficiency that most people mistook for unimportance. He reached the lower wing at the same time he always did. He stopped at the vault door, checked the lock out of habit and frowned slightly. The lock looked the same. The door looked the same. Everything looked exactly as it should. But something made him pause. Some small instinct that came from years of paying close attention to things that other people walked past without thinking. He pressed his hand against the door and pushed. It opened. He stood very still for a moment. Then he stepped inside. The armor was on the shelf exactly where it had been placed weeks ago. But it was not the same. Earith moved closer slowly, his eyes going wide as he brought the light of his tablet up toward the shelf. The great fracture that had split the chest plate clean across the middle was gone. Not patched. Not covered. Gone. The metal surface was smooth and unbroken, and when he leaned in close he could see the faint lines where the crack had been, healed so completely that they looked like nothing more than old marks in the finish. The shoulder guard that had been partially melted and curled back was restored to its original shape, the surface even and clean. And the three missing panels were back, fitted into their places so precisely that if he had not known they were missing he would never have guessed they had not always been there. He stood in the vault for a long time without moving. Then he turned around and walked very quickly toward the Queen's chambers. Sorvain was in the middle of her morning war briefing when Earith appeared at the chamber door. Her generals were gathered around the long table, maps and reports spread across the surface, voices low and focused. She looked up at Earith with the expression she used when someone interrupted something important, flat and cold and promising consequences. Earith did not flinch. He was old enough and trusted enough to know when something was worth interrupting for, and he walked straight to her side and spoke quietly into her ear. The room went still. Sorvain did not move for several seconds. Then she stood up from the table slowly, the way a storm builds before it breaks, and told her generals the briefing was over for the morning. They filed out quickly and without argument. Nobody asked questions when the Queen used that particular tone. She walked to the lower wing herself. She did not rush. Her stride was the same powerful and deliberate movement it always was, but the generals who passed her in the corridor felt the temperature of the air around her and stepped aside without being asked. Earith walked beside her in silence, keeping pace, saying nothing more. When she entered the vault and saw the armor she stopped. She looked at it for a long time. Her expression did not change. Her face was completely still. But her hands, hanging at her sides, closed slowly into fists and then opened again. Closed and opened. The amber in her eyes deepened to something closer to dark gold, the color they went when her emotions were running very hot beneath the surface and she was working very hard to keep them there. She reached out one hand and touched the chest plate with the tips of her claws, running them slowly along the line where the great fracture had been. She could feel the repair. Faint, very faint, like a scar that had healed cleanly. She moved her hand to the shoulder guard and pressed her palm flat against the surface. Then she looked at the replacement panels, studying the engravings on them, tracing the lines of the recreated crests with one careful claw. She pulled her hand back. When she spoke her voice was very quiet and very controlled, and that made it more frightening than if she had shouted. She asked Irith who had done this. Irith told her he did not know. She asked him who had access to this wing. He told her the Dracary engineering staff, the senior guards on night rotation, and the human labor exchange workers who maintained the ventilation and mechanical systems in this section of the fortress. The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. Then Sorvain turned and walked out of the vault and down the corridor and up through the fortress with that cold and deliberate stride, and every soldier and servant who saw her coming moved out of her path without being told. The human quarters were in the east section of the fortress, a modest set of rooms that the 12 members of the human labor exchange team shared between them. It was early enough in the morning that most of them were just finishing breakfast or preparing for their work assignments when the door opened and 4 of the Queen's personal guard filled the frame. The order was simple. All humans were to come immediately to the main assembly hall. Nobody argued. They were gathered in the center of the large stone hall within minutes, standing in a loose group, some of them still holding their breakfast cups, all of them looking around at the ring of Dracary soldiers surrounding them and keeping their faces carefully neutral. The mood in the room was the kind that made the back of the neck go cold. Nobody knew exactly what was happening, but everyone understood that something had gone wrong somewhere and the answer to what was standing right in front of them. Queen Sorvain entered the hall. The soldiers straightened. The humans went very still. She walked to the center of the room and stood in front of the group and looked at them for a long moment without speaking. Up close she was overwhelming in the way that all Dracary royalty were, massive and silver-scaled and ancient, the kind of presence that made the air in a room feel heavier. But it was her eyes that held the attention. Dark gold and absolutely focused, moving slowly across each human face one by one. Then she spoke. She told them that her vault had been entered without permission. That her sacred armor, a relic 400 years old, a relic that belonged to her bloodline and to the history of her empire, had been touched by unknown hands. She told them that this was a violation of imperial law. That the armor was not a piece of equipment or a broken machine or a project for someone to practice their skills on. It was sacred. It was hers. And whoever had entered that vault without her knowledge or permission had committed an act that could not go unanswered. She asked in a voice that was quiet and absolutely serious who had done it. The hall was silent. Some of the humans looked at each other. Some looked at the floor. Some kept their eyes forward and very carefully did not look anywhere at all. Then Owen stepped forward. He moved without hesitation, one step out from the group and stood in front of them facing the Queen. He was not trembling. He was not pale with fear. He stood the way he always stood, steady and calm, his tool bag still over his shoulder from the morning work he had been about to begin when the guards arrived. He looked up at Sorvain directly, not with arrogance, not with challenge, but with the quiet and settled attention of someone who had decided something and was at peace with the decision. Sorvain looked down at him. The size difference between them was almost absurd. She was enormous and ancient and surrounded by armored soldiers. He was a young human mechanic with calloused hands and a bag full of small tools. But he did not look small in that moment. He looked, in some way that was difficult to explain, exactly the right size for what he was doing. She asked him if he was the one who entered her vault. He said yes. She asked him if he was the one who touched her armor. He said yes. She leaned forward slightly, bringing her massive head down closer to his level, and the dark gold of her eyes was very bright and very close, and the heat of her breath moved his hair when she asked him why. Owen was quiet for just a moment. Not a nervous quiet. A thinking quiet, the kind that comes before a person says something they have already decided is true. Then he looked up at her and said it plainly. He said he fixed it because something that beautiful had no business sitting broken in the dark. The hall was completely silent. Sorvain did not move. She stayed exactly where she was, close and towering, and looked at him for what felt like a very long time. The fury was still in her eyes. Nobody in that room doubted that. But something else had entered it too, something that had not been there a moment before, something quiet and unexpected that even she did not seem entirely prepared for. She straightened up slowly. Then she told the guards to take everyone else back to their quarters. And she told Owen to stay. The last guard stepped out and the heavy door closed behind him. The hall was suddenly very quiet. Sorvain stood in the center of the room with her arms folded across her chest and her eyes fixed on Owen with an expression that was difficult to read. The fury was still there, sitting just beneath the surface like heat beneath stone. But she had not punished him yet. She had not called for a sentence or ordered him removed. She had sent everyone else away and kept only him, and that alone meant something, though Owen was not entirely sure what. He stood where he was and waited. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she spoke. Her voice was measured and controlled, and she told him to explain himself. Not to apologize. Not to beg. To explain. Every choice he had made, every method he had used, every reason he had for entering that vault and putting his hands on something that was not his to touch. Owen nodded once. He set his tool bag down on the floor beside him, reached inside and pulled out his small notebook. He held it open in one hand and began to talk. He started at the beginning. He told her about the night he had first found the vault, how the smell of burnt alloy had caught his attention in the corridor, how he had opened the door not out of disrespect but out of the simple instinct of someone who had spent his whole life noticing damaged things. He told her what he had seen when his work light first fell across the armor, and he said it the same way he had said it to himself that night, that it was the most extraordinary thing he had ever seen. Even broken. Even cracked and incomplete and sitting alone in the dark. Sorvain said nothing. She was watching him carefully. He told her about the fracture pattern on the chest plate. He described it in detail, the direction of the crack, the depth of it, the way the metal had failed under the stress that caused it. He explained that the ancient Dracary alloy had a grain structure unlike anything produced today, that whoever had originally smelted and worked that metal had understood properties of the material that modern engineers had lost access to along with the original process. He said this not to flatter her. He said it because it was true and because he believed in saying true things accurately. He saw something shift slightly in her expression when he said that. He continued. He walked her through the paste formula he had developed, explaining the earth metallurgy technique it was based on and why he believed it would be compatible with the Dracary alloy. He told her about the 3 nights he had spent just studying the shoulder guard before he touched it, how he had tested 2 different approaches on small areas before he found the method that worked, how he had made one small error on the second night and spent an additional hour correcting it. He did not leave that part out. He thought it was important to say. He told her about the missing panels. He explained how he had studied the surviving engravings for hours before he attempted to recreate them, learning the depth and the angle and the spacing of the original craftsman's cuts. He said that the replacement panels were not identical to the originals at the material level because he did not have access to the original alloy and could not pretend otherwise. But he had done everything within his ability to make them faithful to what had been there. He had treated every engraving line as something worth getting exactly right. He closed his notebook. He looked up at her and said simply that he thought the person who made that armor originally had been one of the finest craftsmen he had ever encountered the work of, in any species, in any material. And that a piece of work like that deserved every hour he had put into it. The hall was quiet again. Sorvain had not moved during his entire explanation. She had stood in the same position with her arms folded, watching him, listening with the complete and focused attention of someone who was taking in every word and weighing it carefully. Now she unfolded her arms slowly and walked toward the far side of the hall, moving to the tall narrow window there and looking out at the pale morning sky beyond the fortress walls. Her back was to him. Owen waited. When she spoke again her voice was different. Not softer exactly. But the controlled quality it had carried before, the careful tension of someone managing their emotions very deliberately, was less tight than it had been. Something had loosened slightly. She told him the armor was made 430 years ago. She said it was commissioned by the first queen of her bloodline, a warrior named Sorvain the Elder, which was where her own name came from. The craftsman who made it had spent 2 years on it alone, working with an alloy formula that he had developed himself over a lifetime of study. When he finished it he declared it the finest thing he had ever made. He was not wrong. It had survived 4 centuries and more battles than anyone had properly counted. Owen listened without speaking. She told him the armor had passed from queen to queen through her entire bloodline. Every queen who wore it added something small to it, one new engraving, one small mark, a continuation of a conversation in metal that had been going on for 400 years. She told him that when she first wore it she had stood in front of it for a long time before she put it on, looking at every mark left by the queens before her, her mother and her grandmother and all the ones before them going back to the beginning. She stopped talking for a moment. Then she said that the armor had belonged to her mother. She said it quietly and simply, the way a person says something that carries a great deal of weight in very few words. Her mother had worn it in 17 battles. Her mother had added her own engraving to the left side panel, a small and precise mark that was not decorative but personal, the kind of mark a person makes when they want to leave proof that they were there. When her mother died the armor had passed to her and she had added her own mark beside her mother's. Owen looked down at the floor for a moment. He was thinking about the left side panel. He thought about the engraving he had studied so carefully before recreating it on the replacement panel. He had noticed that one particular mark was different from the others around it, more personal in its character, less formal. He had reproduced it exactly. He had not known what it meant. Now he did. Sorvain turned from the window. She told him that when her engineers said the armor was beyond saving, she had not felt angry at first. She had felt something that she did not have a word for, a hollow and heavy feeling that sat in her chest and did not move. She had failed to protect it. 400 years it had survived, and she was the queen on whose watch it was finally destroyed. She had felt the weight of every queen before her looking at her across the centuries, and she had not been able to bear it. So she had turned it into anger because anger was easier to carry than grief. She had locked the armor away because she could not look at it. Because looking at it broken was worse than not looking at it at all. She had told herself the matter was closed, and she had worked very hard to believe it. Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said something carefully. He said that the mark her mother had left on the left side panel was still there. That when he recreated the panel he had studied that particular mark for a long time because it was different from the others and he wanted to make sure he got it right. He said he did not know whose mark it was when he reproduced it. He only knew that it mattered. Sorvain looked at him. Something moved through her expression that was not anger and was not the cold authority she usually wore like a second armor. It was something older and quieter than either of those things. She held his gaze for a long moment, and then she walked slowly back to where he stood and stopped in front of him. She was still enormous, and he was still a young human mechanic standing in a fortress hall with a notebook in his hand. But the distance between them felt different now than it had when the guards first brought him here. Something had crossed it in the last hour. Something that could not be unlocked with a tool or measured in a notebook but was real nonetheless. She looked down at him and asked him one question. She asked him if the armor was truly whole again. Owen met her eyes and said yes. Not almost. Not close enough. Oh. For the first time since she had entered the hall, the expression on Sorvain's face changed completely. The dark gold of her eyes softened to something closer to the amber they usually were. The tension across her shoulders released slowly, like a breath let out after being held for a very long time. She did not smile. Dracary queens did not smile easily. But she nodded. And in that nod was something that felt, quietly and unmistakably, like relief. The news moved through the fortress faster than anyone expected. By midday every Dracary soldier and servant in the building knew the basic shape of what had happened. A human mechanic had entered the queen's sealed vault without permission. He had handled the sacred ceremonial armor. He had repaired it. And he was still walking around the fortress without chains on his wrists. That last part was the one that caused the most trouble. In the great dining hall that evening the conversations were low and tight and full of the particular energy that comes when people who are used to clear rules suddenly find themselves looking at something that does not fit neatly inside them. Soldiers who had spent their careers inside a system built on hierarchy and tradition looked at each other across their meals and asked the same question in different ways. If a human could walk into the queen's vault and touch her most sacred possession and face no punishment, then what exactly did the old boundaries mean anymore? It was the kind of question that made traditionalists very uncomfortable. And nobody in that fortress was more of a traditionalist than Aldrich. He had spent the day thinking carefully. Aldrich was not a foolish soldier. He had served the Dracary Empire for 31 years and he understood the difference between a fight worth having and one that would only cost him. But he also understood something that he believed very deeply, that certain things existed for good reasons and that allowing those things to be casually set aside, even once, even for a seemingly harmless reason, was how empires began to lose their shape. The vault had been sealed by the Queen's direct order. The armor was imperial property of the highest sacred classification. No one entered without permission. That was not a minor rule. That was a fundamental boundary, and a human laborer had crossed it, and the Queen had responded by sending everyone else away and having a quiet conversation with him instead of a public punishment. Aldrich had watched that human walking those corridors for weeks. He had seen him slipping into that vault night after night and said nothing, waiting, gathering information the way a careful soldier does. He had told himself he was being thorough. Now he wondered if he had waited too long. If he had reported it earlier, the whole situation might have been handled quietly before it became something the entire fortress was talking about. He could not change that now. What he could do was make sure the court understood what was at stake. He spent the evening sending messages. To the noble families who maintained residences in the fortress. To the senior generals who had been at that morning briefing. To the imperial advisors who traveled with the Queen's court and whose job it was to protect the reputation and the legal framework of the empire. He was careful in how he wrote. He did not attack the Queen's judgment directly. He framed everything around imperial law and tradition, around the importance of maintaining clear boundaries, around the message that silence would send to every other species watching the Dracary Empire from a distance. By the following morning he had enough. The request for a formal court gathering was submitted through the proper channels before the morning meal was finished. The throne room of the fortress was a large and serious space. The walls were old dark stone carved with the histories of Dracari military victories going back centuries. The floor was a deep gray that had been polished so many times over so many years that it held a faint reflection of whatever stood on it. At the far end was the throne itself, cut from a single piece of dark volcanic rock, simple and massive and very old. It was not a decorative room. It was a room built to make clear, in the most direct architectural language possible, exactly where power lived. It filled quickly. The noble families came in their formal dress, scales gleaming, expressions carefully arranged. The generals took their positions along the left wall in order of rank. The imperial advisors clustered near the front with their record tablets and their watchful eyes. Lesser soldiers and fortress staff filled the spaces along the walls, too junior to have formal standing in a court gathering but present because everyone understood that what happened in this room today would be talked about for a long time. Aldrich stood near the front. He was in full dress uniform, every scale polished, his posture exactly correct. He had made sure to arrive early enough to speak briefly with several of the nobles before the proceedings began, reinforcing the points he had made in his messages, ensuring that the voices he needed were ready to be heard. Owen was brought in by 2 guards and placed to one side of the room. He was not in chains. He had not been formally charged with anything yet, but the positioning was clear enough. He stood with his hands relaxed at his sides and looked around the room with the same calm attention he gave to everything, reading the space the way he would read a damaged piece of equipment, quietly and without panic. The room waited. Then the doors at the far end opened. Queen Sorvain entered the throne room. The sound that moved through the gathered court was not quite a gasp. It was something quieter than that, a collective intake of breath, a sudden and involuntary stillness that fell over every person in the room at exactly the same moment. She was wearing the armor. The full ceremonial battle armor, restored and complete, sat on her frame the way it had been designed to 400 years ago, perfectly fitted, every panel in place, every engraving catching the light of the throne room lamps in the same way it had caught light in 100 battles across centuries of Dracari history. The chest plate was unbroken. The shoulder guard was whole. The replacement panels were indistinguishable from the originals to any eye in that room that did not already know to look. She walked to the throne and stood in front of it. She did not sit. Standing was more deliberate. Standing in that armor in that room meant she had come not to preside from a distance but to speak directly, and everyone present understood the difference. The silence held for a long moment. Then Aldrich stepped forward. He was respectful in his manner and precise in his words. He acknowledged the Queen's authority first as protocol required. Then he laid out his position clearly. The vault had been sealed by imperial order. The armor carried the highest sacred classification in Dracari law. A member of the Human Labor Exchange, a foreign worker with no imperial standing and no granted access, had entered a restricted space and handled a protected relic on multiple occasions over several weeks. These were not accusations. They were recorded facts. And Dracari imperial law was unambiguous on the matter of unauthorized access to sacred imperial property. He paused for a moment. He said that he meant no disrespect to the outcome. He acknowledged that the armor had been restored. He said that was not the point. The point was that the law existed for reasons that went beyond any single outcome, good or bad. If the boundary could be crossed without consequence when the result happened to be favorable, then the boundary meant nothing. And a boundary that meant nothing protected nothing. Several voices from the noble side of the room offered quiet agreement. Aldrich finished and stepped back. The room turned its attention to the Queen. Sorvain had listened to every word with her eyes on Aldrich and her expression completely still. She stood in the restored armor, her hands at her sides, her posture carrying the particular quality it had when she was not managing her emotions but had simply decided what she was going to do and was at peace with it. She let the silence sit for one moment after Aldrich finished. Then she spoke. She said that Aldrich was a good soldier and that his argument was a careful one and that she had heard it fully. She said that imperial law and tradition were not small things and that she did not treat them as small things. Then she looked out across the entire gathered court and her voice was clear and steady and reached every corner of that room without effort. She said that her armor had been broken beyond what her finest engineers could repair. She said they had examined it and declared it lost, and she had accepted that verdict and locked the armor away because she believed there was no other choice. She said that a human mechanic with no imperial standing and no formal permission had looked at what her engineers called impossible and decided it was not. He had spent weeks working alone in the night, using knowledge and skill and a patience that she did not think many in this room fully appreciated, and he had returned to her something that she had believed was gone forever. She paused. She said she would not punish skill. She said she would not punish respect. Because what had been shown to that armor in that vault, night after night by a person who had nothing to gain and no guarantee of safety, was respect of the deepest kind. The kind that did not ask for permission before it cared about something. She said that punishing that would be the only true dishonor she could imagine committing in this room today. The court was completely silent. Aldrich stood very still. His expression had not changed, but something behind his eyes had shifted. Some of the certainty he had walked in with had quietly left him, and he was not entirely sure when it had gone. Sorvain looked across the room one final time. Then she turned her gaze to Owen, standing quietly to the side, and held it there for just a moment. Owen looked back at her steadily. Nobody in that throne room said another word. The throne room emptied slowly. The nobles filed out in small groups, speaking to each other in low voices, the kind of conversations that happen after something significant has occurred and nobody is entirely sure yet what to make of it. The generals left in their order of rank, faces unreadable in the careful way of people who have learned to process surprising things privately. The imperial advisors gathered their tablets and moved toward the doors with the brisk efficiency of people who already had a great deal to write down. Aldrich was one of the last to leave. He walked out without looking back, his posture still correct, his uniform still perfect. But something about the set of his shoulders was different from when he had walked in. The hard certainty that had carried him through the morning was quieter now, not gone entirely but no longer sitting at the front of everything the way it had been. He moved through the doorway and disappeared into the corridor, and the door closed behind him. The guards gestured for Owen to follow them out as well. He picked up his tool bag from the floor where he had set it and walked toward the exit. He was almost at the door when one of the Queen's personal attendants stepped forward and told him quietly that the Queen would see him privately. Not now. That evening. He was to come to the small council chamber adjacent to the throne room at the third evening bell. Owen nodded and said he would be there. Then he went back to work. He spent the rest of the day doing exactly what he always did. There were ventilation units that needed checking in the north wing. There was a pressure valve in the workshop area that had been making an irregular sound for 3 days, and he had been meaning to look at it properly. He worked through his tasks in the same order and at the same pace he always used, moving through the fortress corridors with his bag over his shoulder and his attention on whatever was directly in front of him. People looked at him differently now. Not everyone, but enough that he noticed. Some of the Dracari soldiers who had previously looked straight through him the way you look through furniture now looked at him directly when he passed. A few of them held the eye contact for a moment before looking away. One younger soldier, barely past his training years by the look of him, stepped aside to let Owen pass through a narrow corridor and gave a small nod as he did it. Owen nodded back and kept walking. He was not sure what to do with any of it, so he set it aside and focused on the pressure valve, which turned out to have a small crack in its housing that he fixed cleanly in about 40 minutes. The third evening bell rang through the fortress as Owen reached the door of the small council chamber. He knocked once. A voice told him to enter. The room was smaller than the throne room in every way. No carved histories on the walls. No polished floor. Just a working space, a long table, a few chairs, a lamp burning low on a side shelf, and a narrow window showing the deep blue of the evening sky outside. Sorvain was standing at the window when he entered, still wearing the ceremonial armor. She had not changed out of it since the throne room, and somehow in this smaller and quieter space it looked even more striking than it had in front of the full court. She heard him come in and turned from the window. She told him to sit down. He sat. She remained standing for a moment, looking at him with that focused amber gaze. Then she moved to the table and sat across from him, which surprised him slightly. Queens did not usually sit across from human mechanics. They stood above them or they kept a distance that made the difference in their sizes feel deliberate. But she sat across from him like someone who had decided that whatever this conversation was going to be, it would happen between two people at the same table. She reached into a compartment in the side of her armor and drew something out. She placed it on the table between them. It was small. A flat piece of deep blue metal, roughly oval in shape, no bigger than Owen's palm, with a symbol engraved in the center that he did not recognize. The engraving was precise and complex, the kind of mark that had been made by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The metal itself had a quality to it that he noticed immediately, old and dense and with a surface finish that spoke of serious craft. He looked at it without touching it. Sorvain told him what it was. She said it was a Dracari artisan's mark. She said there were fewer than 200 of them in existence across the entire empire, granted across 4 centuries of Dracary history to craftsmen whose work had been formally recognized as meeting the imperial standard of excellence. Recipients were almost exclusively Dracary. There were 3 exceptions in the entire historical record, 2 from allied species and 1, she said, from a human, though that had been over 100 years ago and most people had forgotten it. She slid the mark across the table toward him. Owen looked at it for a moment. Then he looked up at her. She told him it was not a ceremony. She had not brought the court back together for it and she did not intend to. This was between the 2 of them and the work he had done, and that was sufficient. The mark was real and its protections were real. It meant he carried imperial recognition as a craftsman of standing. No Dracary soldier or official could detain him or restrict his movement within imperial territory without cause. It also meant his work was officially acknowledged as meeting a standard that the Empire respected. She told him to pick it up. He reached out and picked it up carefully. It was heavier than it looked. He turned it over in his hands once and looked at the engraving on the front and then set it gently on the table in front of him. He told her thank you. He said it simply and directly without anything extra around it, and she seemed to appreciate that. There was a short quiet between them that was not uncomfortable. Then Sorvain looked at him and asked him something. She said she had been thinking since their conversation in the hall. She said she had been thinking about something that she could not find a satisfying answer to on her own, and she wanted to ask him directly because she believed he would answer honestly. She asked him why humans worked so hard to save things that everyone else had already given up on. Owen was quiet for a moment. He was not being slow because the question was difficult. He was being slow because he wanted to answer it correctly, the way he would approach a repair, taking the time to find the right method before he started rather than rushing in and having to correct mistakes later. Then he said it. He said that when something is made well, made with real care and real skill and real attention, the person who made it put something of themselves into it. Not in a way you can measure or see directly. But it is there. It goes into the work the same way heat goes into metal. It changes the thing at a level that is deeper than the surface. And that does not go away when the thing gets broken. The love that went into making it is still inside it, still part of what it is, waiting underneath the damage. He said that when he looked at broken things he did not see what they were now. He saw what they were made to be. And the distance between those 2 things was just work. Work he knew how to do. He said that abandoning something broken, when you had the means to fix it, felt to him like deciding that the person who made it with all that care did not matter anymore. And he could not make himself believe that. He stopped talking. The room was very quiet. Sorvain sat across from him and said nothing for a long moment. She looked at the mark sitting on the table between them, and then she looked at Owen, and her expression had the quality of someone hearing something that has rearranged a small but important part of how they see the world. Then she gave one slow nod. It was the same nod she had given him in the hall after he told her the armor was whole again. Deliberate and unhurried and carrying the full weight of what it meant in Dracary tradition. The deepest acknowledgement one person could offer another. Owen nodded back quietly. In the weeks that followed, things changed in the fortress in ways that were small at first and then not small at all. The human labor exchange program was expanded without announcement, 3 additional humans arriving from the territories within the month, assigned not to general maintenance but to the engineering division directly. Sorvain signed the order herself. The joint engineering division came together gradually, the way good things usually do, through small moments of shared work rather than any single grand declaration. A Dracary engineer asking Owen a question about his paste formula one afternoon. Owen sitting with 2 Dracary craftsmen studying an old repair problem for an hour because all 3 of them found it interesting. A human and a Dracary working side by side on a project that neither could have completed as quickly alone and both knowing it. Aldrich watched all of this from a distance for several weeks. Then one morning he walked into the engineering workshop and stood at the entrance for a moment looking around at the humans and Dracary working together at the benches. Owen was at the far end of the room, deep in a conversation with a young Dracary craftsman over a piece of equipment between them, both of them pointing at the same spot and talking at the same time the way people do when they are both genuinely interested in the same problem. Aldrich stood there for a long moment. Then he walked to the workshop supervisor and told her quietly that he wanted to be assigned a human working partner. She looked at him for a moment. Then she wrote his name down. Owen never knew about that conversation. He was already working on the next broken thing by the time it happened. Sitting at his bench in the warm light of the workshop, completely at peace, the artisan's mark sitting in his jacket pocket where he kept it every day, small and heavy and real. Above him somewhere in the throne room a dragon queen wore her restored armor and remembered a quiet human who had walked into a locked room one night not to take anything but to give something back. And in the Empire's first ever joint engineering division the work went on, Human hands and Dracry hands building things together, fixing things together, neither of them stopping to ask whose tradition it belonged to because the work itself had already answered that. It belonged to anyone willing to care enough to do it right.